actually reminds me of I think this is the right guy, Bruno Giordano.
Hmm.
I think it's him.
The
So
Heretic.
it was like a fuck, what was it called? He had an idea. It was like a memory palace or something, and
Hmm.
it was like you would have 7 tiers and 7 columns and 7 rows and artifacts. I'm not doing a good job of explaining it, but basically his idea was like you would look out and there would be these different qualities to each of the exhibits where they would have like, different media representations and text and potentially music and stuff, but where you could look out and have look out upon the entire sum of human knowledge, basically was his
Hmm.
idea. And like look out at that, at all these symbolic things, and if you wanted to go into the details, you get closer, you know what I mean, you go up to it. But his thought was that you could use this memory theater, memory palace thing. I can't even remember exactly what he called it, but something like that,
Yeah,
to
interesting.
like as a meditative focal point, to kind of like for a mystic, wow, this is such a
Hmm.
fascinating idea, man.
Yeah, yeah, really cool. Like the idea of a memory palace has always fascinated me from watching like Sherlock. Um, he's depicted as having one, but also the imagery as well. I think is really important. Like to create a solid mnemonic in your head of
Yeah,
something. I've had this image of like being inside a sphere, and each there's kind of like squares. Each the sphere is made up of like hundreds of little squares, and each of those squares is kind of like a piece of information or a piece of knowledge of some kind, and they're seemingly disparate quite often, but actually they're connected in this overall
yeah,
sphere.
definitely.
I haven't worked with it too much, but it's kind of similar thing, like trying to find the information that I need to access. And yeah, I definitely and obviously don't use it very often. Otherwise, I'd remember these names of things.
Yeah,
Actually,
no.
one of the books I was trying to remember earlier was Roberto Assagioli's Psychosynthesis, about the nature of psychosis and the self.
Yeah. I mean, maybe we could circle back around a little bit to psychosis and the relationship between that and spiritual or mystical experiences, and the connection between that and synchronicity, because there's a great quote. I think we brought it up before we started recording, right? Which is the psychotic drowns in the same waters that the mystic swims in.
Was it the other way around?
I
I
don't
think
know. It
you
might be the
corrected
other way
me
around.
before.
I felt that moment where I was like, "Oh no, now I'm not sure what way it is."
Maybe it doesn't matter. It's
It does.
tautological.
It doesn't really matter, no. Anyway, the
Yeah.
sentiment is what's important, which I definitely think that there's something. Not only I think it's a quote from Jung, and not only is there something super valid and profound in that, but it's actually a distillation of his personal experience. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Because obviously Jung is famous for being a psychiatrist, famous for being one of the founders of psychology. Jung's way of thinking about psychology is personally my favorite. But the extraordinary thing about him as a figure, in the history of psychology, is that he experimented on himself with his method and
Mm.
recorded all his observations, and effectively went half crazy for a while he tried to, he induced what is got to be close to a latent psychosis, and then tried to work his way through it,
Mm.
and successfully did it, and ended up becoming, from his own accounts, much more of a person through that experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And yeah, there's just something really fascinating, I think, about the idea of active. He called it active imagination, obviously, like actively engaging with and um, participating in the fantasy that is almost like you're having the fantasy whether you will admit to it or not. You know what
Mm.
I mean? And
Yeah.
just trying to bring light to that, and trying to own that to me is always really fascinating. And the line, I guess, between that and psychosis and spiritual
Mm.
emergence is really hard, I think, to define. And that's why at the beginning, when you kind of said, recognizing the difference, part of the question I want to ask is, how do you recognize the difference? And you said, the archetypal images, which that seems like a good answer. But like, as it kind of seemed like when I kind of queried, well, then what would be those other cases, right? You're like, well, the kind of similar kind of thing with the fracturing and the leaking through of unconscious contents, which makes sense. But I guess part of my puzzlement is that it seems to me that the self-healing nature of the psyche is archetypal in nature. So I have difficulty imagining a case of psychosis that wouldn't have archetypal qualities.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right there. And like if we are positing the kind of self-healing nature of the psyche in the sense of like, you know, when it's psychosis or spiritual emergency, it's the unbidden kind of thrust upon us version of the healing.
Yeah.
But there's some version of it where we're actually leaning in, and things become kind of more synchronistic of sorts when that leaning in is happening.
Okay,
And,
okay.
and I
So
think there's
maybe whether we're fighting it or not is
right.
maybe the big
And
difference.
partly we're fighting it or not, depending on how other people are helping us
Yeah,
frame
no, I
it
think that's
and
really, I
responding
just
to it.
got a bit of goosebumps there. I think that's really, I want to write that down.
Mm. Yeah, there's definitely a feeling of like the leaning in is what the mystic is doing, right? Like the
For sure, yeah, no,
intentional
yeah.
uncovering of like, well, what is this world behind the world?
I feel like that is really worth remembering, because that to me seems like a very important insight, that, you know, the thought that, like, because I think we opened the discussion kind of talking a little bit about the pathologizing attitude of psychology and
Hmm.
psychiatry and how that can make it worse, and to recognize that if the pivotal thing between, say, a progressive psychosis and a regressive psychosis is whether we're fighting it or not, then that places the onus directly on the physician's attitude. Do you know what I mean? Because he or she is the only person who will be able to intervene in that.
Yeah, but I guess there's another issue of like, what is this? Like, if let's say I've got a client who's having psychotic symptoms,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like, well, what is this person's support network? Like, if I guide them further in this episode, are they going to be able to leave in 15 minutes and make it home, or are they going to, there's a lot to consider in terms
Yeah.
of, actually making that
Well, and
decision.
I think that's part of the problem with psychology as a commercial thing, right? Is that you have to be able to support yourself, and so there's constraints. I've always felt this is part of the problem with psychology, is that, like, in my own experience, most of the healing I do is the kind of thing that you couldn't commodify, and that requires substantial investments outside of what reasonably the person can repay you for. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Like, it seems like, in a way, healing and the commodifying instinct run, they're directly at loggerheads in some way.
Yeah. And there's, when, I'm always tempted in my therapy sessions to do kind of as much psychoeducation as possible. It's like, I want to give this person the tools to not need me anymore, in essence,
Sure,
which,
yes,
isn't
yeah,
a
I think
very
that's a good
good
idea.
strategy for making money, but it's, for
No, that's a
me, that's
great
kind of
idea
why I
though
want to
for
do it.
helping people to heal themselves. Yeah, I think
Yeah, exactly. It's like how we will go through processes and there will be kind of explicit healing journeys or whatnot in sessions, but ideally those processes are kind of made explicit in a way where they can then take it
yeah,
home and continue with the
yeah. Well, that's kind
resources.
of what I mean. Is because when I get into that situation, I don't have another client soon, right? I don't have, because it's
Mm,
not commercialized, because it's not. Uh like, if I get into that situation, it's like, okay, like, this is the priority. Everything else I've got to do goes on hold until you're good to leave this interaction, and you'll be okay. Do you know what I mean? So
yeah.
if that means like 3 or 4 hours, that's what that means. You know what I mean?
Mm. I try
Yeah.
not to run over more than half an hour if I can help it.
No,
But
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, but, and that makes sense. But I just mean, like, if someone is not in a state to stop, you know what I mean? Like, it's not resolved. You've
Yeah.
opened it up because they needed it opened up. It's like a surgery, you know what I mean? It's like, you got to finish. You can't just stop because the bell rang. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? You
Yeah.
got to
Exactly.
finish.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a sense of like requiring in a surgery requires like precision and gentleness and yeah, it feels the same with a psychic surgery of sorts. Like
Yeah.
you gotta
No, yeah, exactly. And I think
um,
that's a really good way of thinking about it, is that, what you are trying to do is the minimally invasive intervention,
mm,
to help them begin to heal. You know what I mean?
right. It's
Yeah.
interesting as well, like talking about kind of active imagination and these sort of it feels like Jung's tools that he discovered were very helpful for him because he had a kind of mind that was helpful for. Not everybody has a good capacity for imagining things.
Yes, I think especially, say, like encouraging or facilitating the manifestation of unconscious contents, you got to have a certain kind of temperament to be capable of withstanding that and not cracking under the pressure, say. And so, and I think, it reminds me of, I can't remember who it is, but it's the writings of some mystic, Christian mystic, I think, who basically puts at the beginning of one of his books, if you are not a spiritual self-surmounter, leave my books alone. Focus on whatever nonsense you care about, but do not dabble with this unless you are the type of person who is cut out for it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think EMDR is sort of this modern empirical based working therapy
What's that
that
one
is
again?
eye movement
Yeah,
directional
yeah.
rehabilitation. I can't remember exactly the acronym, but it's kind of well, I think different practitioners probably do it differently, but some of my experiences of EMDR is resourcing, finding resources that will help you in the journey ahead, and subsequent sessions are kind of deepening the connection with those resources, and they're sort of available after the sessions as well. So kind of like, imagine a place where you felt like the most comfortable and safe, and imagine a figure that represents maybe something that you need right now, like power or insight or whatever that is. And then going into the work of like whatever you're bringing, where's that leading to? And for me, because I am a very visual person, it always becomes like quite a visual storytelling moment. And quite often it is very much like active imagination for me. It's almost like, I'm seeing this is happening. This is how this character is responding. I kind of feel like doing this in the vision, and then I just play it out and connect with.
I think that there's potentially more secure or safer ways of framing the engagement with active imagination. I think Jung went into it without any guardrails because
he's experimenting.
Well, he's experimenting, and also I think he felt he had the stuff in him. He had that dog in him. I don't know.
Yeah. There's also a sense as well that we can access our unconscious content through like our body, for example, like the focusing techniques, as I like to frame it under, is that every piece of content has multiple points in our experience, like this, the kind of symbolic domain, the story domain, the sensory domain, and the emotional domain. They're all arising at the same time, but we have preferences of how we like to feel it or not. So there is a kind of active imagination of sorts available to people who don't have a good imagination, but it's not active imagination anymore. It's maybe like working with a sensation and relating to that sensation, or a kind of sensation plus emotion plus story, or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, like my version of active imagination is something like it's like a fusion between fiction and autobiographical storytelling. So it's not visual. It's narrative basically. It's made of words. I'm making a world of words, and then I'm trying to live in that way.
Yeah, cool.
What was I going to say? God damn it.
Well, the interesting thing is that these faculties that we have in our experience, they're parts of our experience, are all, if they're all connected, and they're kind of, we can explore the healing, the self-healing nature of the psyche is possible through, all these different domains of our experience. Thinking like, what does that tell us about the psyche? Like, is it just something in a head, or is it actually connected throughout our whole system?
Well, I think I definitely think the psyche is not something localized in our head. I think that octopuses are a really good, or octopi rather, are a good model. We know octopi have distributed consciousness throughout their bodies. Their tentacles can partially think for themselves.
Mm.
The tentacle can make decisions without that electrical information traveling back to the main brain because they're neuronal cells. And
Mm-hmm.
in fact, we know that neuronal cells are distributed throughout the human body. We know that the heart has neurons in it, quite a chunk of them. And we also know that when people get organ transplants, it changes their personality. We have lots of empirical evidence that
Mm.
organ transplants carry some semblance of the person who the organ belonged to. Which is very strange, but not that strange if you consider that you are your whole body. It's not just
Yeah.
we very much because the brain is so important. We identify very much with this thing up here, and there's a good reason for that because most of what me is, as far as my personality, is processing up here. You know what I mean?
Right.
But all of that, like in a broader sense, in a more holistic sense, me is a brain body complex, and the brain and the body are intermeshed, not just in a linear top down kind of chunk.
Mm.
It's like the brain and body are interwoven. That's what, like, my neural, what would you call it, sorry, the nerves, my nervous system is literally just like the appendage part of my brain. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. And if you look at pictures where they've taken the whole nervous system out of the body, it kind of still looks like a body. Like it's
Yeah,
just fully just goes in every single point of the body
exactly. Yeah.
anyway. So we are just kind of a distributed information system.
Yep, and equally, you can think of your spine. Your spine is like a very important piece of hardware, for
Mm.
you. Yeah, I think your spine and your brain make up probably 75% of what you are, but your body is a very important part of that, as partly because, especially the brain, is a secondary phenomenon. Like you have you have sophisticated bodies way before you have sophisticated brains. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, an accident that we ended up with a very sophisticated brain.
Yeah, there's also a sense that we can do incredible things physically without much of our brain turned on. I mean, there's obviously always brain functioning, but like we can
Yeah,
sleepwalk and make a sandwich and
yeah. I
do
mean,
it.
you can take most of what we use, what we modern humans use. You can take most of that brain out, and your motor functions and your normal autonomic functions are intact, and you'll be able to satisfy your thirst and so on. You're like the reptilian part of your brain will still be online and
Mm-hmm.
operative.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? There's just like this small layer of extra stuff that seems to make all the difference.
Yeah, no, it's definitely. I think it's really important. I think to try to uh, disrupt the intuitive assumption that consciousness is localized primarily in the head. I even think it's plausible that consciousness extends out beyond the body, like that there's some
Mm.
kind of field of consciousness that goes like a meter or so, or maybe less, maybe more. I don't know. That certainly seems
Yeah,
possible to
or
me.
maybe it's something that you can only really access through like very specific training of some kind. And the
Mhm.
reason why it's so hard to empirically verify various different, non-standard modalities of experience is precisely because not many people are even attempting to practice those things. And yeah, so it's like
Yeah,
obviously with empirical evidence, you need more than one point of data to verify it. So it's a hard
yeah,
thing to
yeah.
capture.
I mean, the consciousness extending out from your body thing, that is a supposition that I find plausible for a couple of reasons. So one thing is, the scarab example. I think it makes intuitive sense to me that if people are focusing on something as meaningful, and you imagine that there's this field that extends, then if there's something around that is like that thing that we're really focusing on, that thing could feel drawn to, called to. You know what I mean? That seems
Mm.
plausible, like without giving a detailed description of the
Yeah,
mechanics or
let's
whatever.
avoid the detailed
Yeah, yeah,
metaphysical assumptions needed to make any of this real.
definitely, definitely. But
That
another thing
conversation soon,
is,
though.
similarly with synchronicity, is a lot of people ask how it works. There's this question about, is it really just in your head? Is it just in
Mm.
your head? And I think one way I like to think about it that is helped a lot along by this notion that maybe consciousness extends out is, obviously we like this when we like say that the world is a certain way, represented as being a certain way. There's a way in which you can think of that as we're like looking out at the world and we're painting over the top of it how we think it is, and I think that's really is what's happening on some level. Um, it's not just a metaphor. That almost is
Yeah,
what
yeah.
we do.
Like
But
we only see the small sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. Doesn't mean
yeah,
the rest of it's not always there. It's just that's what we actually are
yeah,
seeing.
yeah. And so part of me thinks, okay, so if we're painting it over the world, and then that the us thing actually is also touching some of that world, then my thought is maybe there's an interference pattern, like when our way of representing things isn't how they really are, right? There's an interference pattern, and then that manifests as
Mm.
synchronicity. That's basically part of how one toy model, say, that I sometimes think about when I'm thinking, how could this work?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I want to have a conversation more specifically around this stuff with you another time. So maybe we
Yeah,
not get
definitely,
into the
definitely.
gritty details of
Yeah.
that.
I mean,
How
I definitely think there is a great conversation to be had around like techniques and ideas and concepts that are useful for people who want to learn to stalk synchronicity.
mm,
But I mean, I think just in connection to what we were saying, obviously the theme of the conversation today is kind of the self-healing nature of the psyche. And I think, when we were talking about active imagination, I a part of a question came up in my mind, which is like, okay, it does seem like you have to be made of a certain kind of stuff to actively, proactively want to dabble and to be safe to do that. You know what I mean?
mm,
So what about for those other people, right? So what about for people who aren't made of that stuff or aren't inclined that way? And I think this is where you get into synchronicity, because proactively engaging with it, I think synchronicity becomes more common, but in a way becomes less important because you know you are more open in general to that way of relating to the world, and so you don't need to be corrected as much, I suppose, which is how I think of synchronicity, as a way of
yeah.
correcting when we close down the world. But when someone's passive, when they don't proactively engage in it, then the only way for that self-healing function to triumph over the ego is for synchronicity, is for something that is meaningful in a way that transcends your ego framework for making sense of the world. And in this, I
Mm,
really love the scarab example, because part of how Jung relates the scarab example was this woman had been to two doctors before him and neither of them could help her. And he diagnoses her problem as having a highly polished Cartesian rationalism with an impeccably geometrical view of reality.
mm,
And he says he tried to sweeten her with a somewhat more human understanding, right? Which is, I take that to mean, not, you can't fit the world in your head, honey. We're all tiny little insignificant creatures. Like, you got to
mm,
have some humility, you know what I mean? Like,
mm,
you got to acknowledge that there are things that you can't predict in advance. The world is more complex than you can imagine.
mm,
And he said that that didn't work. He wasn't able to convince her, and so he had to resign himself to waiting for something to happen, right? And the way he relates it is that when this scarab from her dream came in through the window, he says this broke the ice of her intellectual resistance, and the treatment could now begin to move. The transformation
mm,
could now begin to move. And he says that the actual scarab beetle obviously is a symbol of transformation. But the thing I find so intriguing and illuminating about that is that basically what he's saying is, when the scarab came in through the window from her dream, she was confronted with something she could not explain. And being confronted with something she could not explain, she had to admit that maybe she didn't have all the answers. And
mm,
having admitted that, she opened herself up to get better.
cool. Yeah, it became a sort of Zen koan of sorts in the
Mm-hmm.
moment.
Yeah. And that, I think, is, that's, I think, the inroad for normal people with synchronicity. Most people, there's people who are going to be listening to this who are going to be like, synchronicity sounds cool and all, but I've just never experienced something like that.
Mm,
And I would respond, you probably have. You probably just don't recognize that that's what it was. You probably do have experiences of situations you've been in where they've resolved positively in your favor, in favor of your healing or growth, in a way that's got these weird qualities that you just kind of, you're not sure about, you know what I mean? And a lot of us cope with that just by saying, well, if I can't make sense of it, I'll just mark it as irrelevant. And a crazy thing happens if you mark something as irrelevant, which is you forget about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like you have to purposefully turn towards it and keep trying it on before making your decision, right? Like
Yeah.
it's not going to work for you if you are too skeptical and therefore forget about it. Like, yeah, there has to be some level of
Yes.
persistence.
Openness and attention amplifies synchronistic phenomena. That is
Yeah.
one of the principal rules for anyone getting into it. And I mean, if you're one of those people who has never had an experience like that, has never had a mystical experience, never had a peak experience, um, and of course, you know, this recommendation comes with caveats. Like, obviously, you want to make sure that first of all you're safe to take this kind of thing, and setting and stuff. But psychedelics is a really great way of opening the door to the kind of transformative healing journey that is detached from your rational working through, and also an openness to the difference and the complexity of the world from what you imagine. I think most people, when they have their first psychedelic experience, there's this moment of shock of and a deep appreciative wonder, actually, that, oh, my usual ways of making sense of the world aren't working, and now that I'm thinking about it from here, they don't seem so obvious. Maybe they're not right. You know, there's this
Mm.
crazy radical openness where, when your prior structures aren't working, you know, you see that, oh, maybe, and this echoes the same thing that I was talking about in terms of the scarab, right? You're confronted with something that proves to you that your prior understanding was inadequate. You know, is that reality is more complex than you can imagine. You know, there's that Shakespeare quote. And yeah, I think that this is a really uh, it's an important inroad, I think, for people who want to learn more about this and want to potentially explore synchronicity for the healing effects. Is psychedelics are a medicine, and that is how they've been used in shamanic culture
Mm.
for thousands of years. And if you use them correctly, you can use them in a medicinal way to heal yourself, to start yourself on a journey of transformation and growth. And a psychedelic experience and a mystical experience, there's a certain parallel there. There's a certain phenomenological similarity that, once you've had the psychedelic experience, then you have something to relate it to, which makes it easier to avoid saying, well, I have nothing to make sense of this with, so I'm just going to mark it as irrelevant. After a psychedelic experience, you can go, okay, I mean, this is odd, but I've experienced odder things, though, you know?
Yeah, there's something there as well about like doing it in an intentional way and being able to sit with the experience and kind of keep checking in, like, oh, what's this is interesting, and kind of having that
Yes.
almost scientific experimental mindset towards it. You know, there's a certain point where that becomes really difficult, especially if you take enough to have, you know, kind of an
Yes.
ego death experience, and that can actually bring up a lot for
Precisely.
people.
And if you were trying to take that approach, like an experimental approach, which I would absolutely recommend, and that's why I say setting is so important.
Mm.
But if you wanted to do something like ego death, which definitely you should not try on your first time, I would recommend something like a recorder. You know, like to record yourself, to videotape yourself. You know, because I think there is a lot of valuable information in that, and your memory totally stops functioning properly. Like, you'll be missing chunks, and it won't make sense, and
Yeah,
it'll be
there's
hard
also,
to put back together.
I feel as well, there's an integration, like a after the experience integration as well, that is, there's a risk, right? Like anyone who's coming like to an experience like a psychedelic experience with the mindset of like, oh, well, it's all just chemicals in the brain, or it's a kind of reductive
Yeah.
way of basically missing out on all the gifts of the experience. Like, even if that were true, even if it were just chemicals in the brain, whatever that even means, there's so much more there than the chemical experience. Like,
Yeah.
that's kind of like saying consciousness is just,
Well,
you
yeah,
know,
and I mean, I think it kind of, the argument gets dismantled in the same way, which is like in the first person experience of it, right? So when you take a psychedelic, the idea that it's just chemicals in the brain, just becomes so incoherent as to be
Yeah.
utterly irrelevant.
But that's, I guess, why I mean the integration piece, like that after the experience. Like, I
Oh
don't.
yes. I think an important frame for people to remember in relation to psychedelics is it's much more likely to show you the nature and structure of your subconscious mind than it is to show you the fundamental deep nature of reality. I'm
Mm,
not saying it's impossible to get glimpses into the deep nature of reality, but I'm just saying take your experience with a grain of salt. It's not necessarily what intuitively you might immediately characterize it as.
yeah, exactly. It's kind of like you have to kind of clear your mind of some of the layers of crap that you've been, might have been absorbing for a while.
Exactly. And oftentimes I think people don't really appreciate what the psychedelic experience that they had meant until a few months later, you know. So
Yeah, or years.
if you've got a very radical interpretation and it's only been a couple of days, just chill before telling
Mm-hmm.
everyone about it because you'll probably feel embarrassed in a couple of weeks, you know.
Yeah, I mean, this is my proclivity, but I usually listen to like some Terence McKenna poetry or like some watch some Alex Gray imagery or something like that. You know, like there's
Yeah.
visionary artists that have cultivated a kind of integration in their expression, right? Like it's
Yeah, yeah.
they're taking psychedelics a lot, and what they're
Yeah,
creating is actually
Alan Watts is
Alan.
good for this. Yeah.
Yeah. So what they're creating is actually the perfect kind of tool for integration experience, even if you don't
Yeah,
necessarily agree with
it
all of
gets
it.
you thinking along the right lines, you know.
Mm,
I think another thing that people don't realize is that, and I think this is a really good place to kind of maybe start wrapping up, is I think what people don't realize is that a big part of what makes a psychedelic experience negative or positive is whether you go with the flow. You know,
mm-hmm,
the biggest characteristic that makes a trip so I've taken way too much before, so much that like I didn't just have ego death, like I couldn't make sense of time, I couldn't perceive my friends, like I it felt like the environment was talking to me, like I literally could
mm,
not pick my friends' bodies out from the environment, you know. It's just stressing to be that fucked up actually.
yeah.
But more than anything, it was the thing that I didn't like was that I didn't have any control over my experience at all. And at a certain point, I decided, well, if I get up and walk home, then the experience has to follow me. So in a way,
Mm-hmm,
like I'm in control like that. And so I found a way of going with the experience by saying, well, I'm doing something about it. I'm kind of, you know, rather than just sitting here and being like, I'd like to be sober again. You know
mm,
what I mean?
mm-hmm,
And as I started to come down, you know, then it's a question of choices. Why did I do that? That was silly. Why did I do that? What was my decision making process, you know? And I think that's really important actually, that I don't know, that the willingness to learn from what you're experiencing in the trip, I would say, is the principal pivotal thing that will determine whether you enjoy it or not. Because if you don't want to learn what you're being put through, then it's going to be fighting tooth and nail for 8 hours. You do not want that. It's going to be
yeah, it's
horrible.
painful. Or like doing it at a party where you can't drop
Yeah.
into the experience and sort of
Yes.
everything feels like, you know, the subconscious content becomes everywhere, and it's
Yeah.
all too much. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you definitely want to curate set and setting, especially for an initial trip. The first one, you do
Mm,
not want to fuck with that, because psychedelics are not. It's like any medicine. It's a double edged sword. It's a drug. Like, you know, if you take too much or you take it incorrectly, you could hurt yourself. It is exactly like that.
yeah. And we're not giving anyone medical advice.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So super interesting stuff. I feel like we could keep going, but maybe you're
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
We
yeah.
should wrap up. And
I'd love to explore maybe in our next chat some of the threads we didn't get to today around synchronicity and some of the stalking
Mhm.
synchronicity stuff, and especially some of the stuff you opened up with. I thought was really ripe for that. So like breath work, you know, and I wrote some synonyms while you were talking. So like attention, mindfulness, meditation.
Mhm.
These things for me are all part and parcel of a kind of practice. So related to stalking synchronicity, that so like Buddhist ideas and some Taoist practices, and
Mhm.
there's a whole bunch of stuff that, you know, in some ways good just on a health level. Like breathwork can be good
Yep.
for you, just for your actual body, your physiological health. But there's all these techniques that people do for other reasons that can be repurposed towards stalking synchronicity. And so you can get multiple benefits. Like meditation is one of those things I would recommend to anyone out there to try.
Yeah.
But practicing meditation is really useful, just as a throwaway example, for synchronicity, because a big part of distinguishing the difference between a genuine sign and what you want something to be, so your tendency as a human to read into things what you'd like them to be. A big difference there is how quiet you're able to make it inside yourself, and how
Yeah.
much you're able to filter out the noise or be okay with the noise and rise above it and kind of find yourself in a tranquility where you're able to listen to all the voices without being dominated by one of them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you need some kind of mindfulness to even be able to stop and notice, be like, oh wait, something's happening. Like
Exactly.
that, otherwise you're just caught up in it.
Yeah, and there's an immersion and there's an absorption in that. But yeah, definitely we want to try and that's what synchronicity is all about. Synchronicity is about those moments of waking up and seeing yourself and being like, oh, that's what I'm like. Oh, that's what I'm
Yeah.
doing.
A simple practice that I enjoyed early on is just when you're watching a movie or watching a show, like if you're noticing that you're really absorbed, just try bringing your attention back into your body and just being like, oh, what's going on? Like, what am I feeling right now? And then just get back
Exactly.
absorbed
Yeah.
and practice that coming in and
Yeah,
out.
and in that respect, there's the concept of self-remembering, which is, Uspensky describes it using a watch analogy, right? You can look at your watch, or you can look inwardly and watch yourself. But if you try really hard when you're looking at the watch, you can also look inwardly and watch yourself, and you can kind of maintain this double state. And he calls this self-remembering.
Yeah, it almost reminds me of lucid dreaming techniques, kind of like, oh yeah, if
Yes.
you look at your hands and you wobble your fingers and then you remember to do that in your dream. But if you just remember to do that in everyday life as well, there's a moment to, reflect and come back
And
to
to
yourself.
ground yourself, and definitely, yeah.
All right, cool. Amazing conversation.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm looking forward to the next one. It was really beautiful. I love what we explored, and plenty more threads for next time. So
definitely. All right, until next time.
excellent. Catch you later.